Hi, it's Mark from the Digging Deep podcast. Just a quick one before we get started. Over the past few weeks, we've had more than 15,000 views and listens across the podcast, which is brilliant. So first of all, thank you. But what we are seeing is that a lot of people are watching and listening and not subscribing. So if you are enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe, whether that's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. It makes a big difference and helps us keep growing, bringing in great guests and improving the show each week. Also, give us a follow on social to keep up with everything we've got going on. Right, let's get on with this week's episode. Hello, you there?
Morning. Yeah, morning, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, good, mate. All rosy. Lovely day again today.
I was going to say, mate, I forgot what rain looks like. I think we're on week 8 now, aren't we, of no rain?
You got hosepipe band down there, have you?
We've had, do you know what, this will make you laugh, right? The hosepipe ban from last year, by the way, was only lifted in February this year. And then the hosepipe ban came in June. So bearing in mind that we already had, if you might remember on the previous pod, we already had water interruptions in March and April, and then a ban in June. So yeah, I've you know, and I keep getting emails. This is about you laugh. I keep getting emails saying, you know, put a washing up bowl in your sink every time you wash your hands or something like that. Throw it out on your plants, you know. So it's...
Well, what else has been doing here?
Well, this leads me on to what's doing my head in, right? I'm interested in the viewers and your opinion on this, right? So for the last 4 weeks, the weather report on the phone and everything else says there's a good chance of rain on one of the days, whether it be a Saturday or a Sunday, right? 65% chance of rain, yeah? When the weekends come, or the days come that the rain's meant to be due, there's nothing. It's blue skies. So what's doing my head in is it me, or is the weather report today less accurate than it was 20 years ago? 20 years ago, they used to tell you what's happening, apart from Michael Fish, by the way. 20 years ago, yeah, they tell you what's happening, and it was pretty much on a par, wasn't it? If it said it was going to be windy, it was. If it said there was rain in the afternoon, there was rain in the afternoon. But now it's like a lottery. It goes. It's like, this is the other thing. It's been telling me, oh, it's going to be highs of 25 today, right? I'm driving around in my car. It's telling me it's 31. I'm like, and I'm really hot. You know what I mean? I'm thinking, I thought it was 25. So what's doing my head in is
it doesn't matter. It does depend where you are in the world.
Yeah, well, I do check out Maidstone and London. I do check out where I'm going. I'm not like, oh, I'm going to Scotland, you know, like it's 15 degrees in Scotland. Why is it so hot in London?
Yeah. You sure it ain't that aircon of yours again? You know, the old Tesla aircon again?
Well, I think the aircon's struggling to keep up at the moment, mate. It's like a greenhouse. I've got that glass roof again. I keep getting, but it's not good enough. The sunlight does seem to like burn me head, even through the car.
Well, it would do, wouldn't it? What? And you got one of them canvases? Comes across it.
No. No. What I do next time I'm walking along and I see an old rag on the floor up in London, I'll pick it up and then pin it to the roof.
You have the minute eye things that wind you up, though, didn't you? I mean,
yeah, the accuracy of the weather, I think, is a big one.
You'd be moaning if it was August and it was pissing down.
Yeah, maybe I would. Yeah, I'm just saying. I just thought the accuracy could be better. That's all. You know, tell me really what it is, so at least I can be prepared. Don't tell me it's going to be 5 degrees lower than it actually is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, do you know what's been doing my head in? I know it's been a couple of weeks now, but I just noticed yesterday that the football season actually started. So we've got rid of the World Cup literally a week or two ago. But we've had constant news about the World Cup, haven't we? And I forgot that FIFA had awarded Trump a peace prize, hadn't they?
I mean,
yeah, they awarded it before the World. I forgot all about that before the World Cup, and you think, well, the Nobel Peace Prize don't like offer out Ballon d'Ors, do they, to their people that are doing good work out there, do they? You know, why are FIFA getting involved in that? And it just come back to me that the reason what's doing my nothing is still the American, you know, the whole of America at the moment, the US, what's going on. That's why I thought today, Mark, we'd have a you can see the backdrops, would have a bit of a Ryder cut. Because even though I'm going to play the villain, the US, because I've done a bit over there, and you've done plenty in UK and Europe, I thought we'd pitch ourselves against each other just to see hole by hole where we're going. So if you're up for that, it probably end up being a two-part of this. But I thought we'd do something a little different, and it's the Ryder Cup of plant hire, Europe versus the US. And I know you had your golf hat, but you've...
Yeah, we got that. Yeah, I've got the Callaway, but it's not picking it up. I think the background's so amazing that it don't let me have the hat.
So 18 holes of the biggest questions in equipment rental, and at the end of it, one winner. So now, before anyone starts emailing us, it isn't about deciding that everything in America is brilliant or everything in Europe is better. I suppose what we wanted to know is actually much more interesting. What can the two biggest rental markets in the world learn from each other? Because when you look at them, they've developed very differently. Obviously, the seed was always the UK, spread into America, and then, funny enough, then back into Europe. So that's the circle. We've discussed that before, and the UK was really the first one to have it. But does it make it the best, or have the Americans basically come from behind? So America's created some absolutely enormous businesses. United Rentals alone generates more than 16 billion in annual revenue. You've got Sunbelt, Herc, and a market where consolidation, technology, and scale have completely changed what hire companies can look like. Europe is slightly different. We've got Loxam, Boels, and some huge international operators. But we've also got different countries, languages, regulations, and cultures, a much more fragmented market with some outstanding regional and independent businesses, and which we've spoke about over and over again, Mark. Even someone picked up our line, by the way, in the press the other day, and highlighting our stat that we know that 70% of the UK market is now independent hire companies. And we've done the research a little bit, like what me and Mark would normally do. Mark's got his head stuck in, and we're not just sitting here deciding which one we like. We've looked at companies' accounts, annual reports, industry data, and numbers behind the businesses. Each hole tackles one part of running a great rental company: profitability, rates, utilisation, fleet buying, replacement, customer service, so as transport technology, people, acquisition, sustainability, independence, the lot. For every hole, we'll make the strongest case we can for Team Europe and the strongest case we can for Team USA. And then we'll score it exactly like the Ryder Cup. Win a hole, 1 point. Too close to call, half a point each. And we're not focusing on a close, not forcing a close result. If America wins 14-4, it wins. If 14-4, if Europe wins, Europe wins. The evidence decides it. And then maybe we can look at this on a triannual basis and see what's approved or not. Because underneath all the fun, there's a serious question we're trying to answer. Which side of the Atlantic has actually built the better plant hire model, and what should we be stealing from each other? So this is a two-part Digging Deep special. Today we're playing the front nine. We'll stop after hole 9, look at the half-time scoreboard, and then in part 2, we'll play the back 9 and find out who wins the Ryder Cup of plant hire. So Marky, we're standing on the first tee. But before we do that, to do Europe versus USA, and before we dig in deep, I just want to go over, explain how exactly this is scored, so we don't have many arguments. And there'll be plenty of people that would disagree with us, but it's just our scoring. We're the ones having the fun. If you don't agree, come on and say. So we searched every hole separately. For each subject, we look for the strongest available evidence from Europe and US, the company accounts, annual reports, as we said, industry bodies published, whatever data we could find. Importantly, we deliberately built the strongest argument for both sides. So if you're looking at profitability, for example, we're not just finding for American companies and declaring America the winner. We're looking at the best evidence we can find on both sides and asking whether we're generally comparing like we like. For each hole, we then created a weighted scoring matrix based on the things that actually matter to the particular subject. So the criteria change depends on the whole. For technology, we might look at telematics, digital customer journeys, AI and automation. For transport, we look at things like logistics, efficiency, customer proximity and economics of moving equipment. For people and productivity, we looked at revenue and profit per employee. And for independence, we looked at the ability to compete, differentiate, make money, and ultimately build a valuable business. Each of these factors is given a weighting according to how important we think it is to answer that particular question. So we don't award a full point just because one side comes out slightly ahead. So we've kind of created so that if it was like scoring at 45 to 55 and one was bigger than the other, then it'd be a half point. So there's a barrier there, just to get into that, you know. So everything gets scored separately per hole. If Europe wins, Europe wins. If US wins, US wins. And because the real purpose of the Ryder Cup isn't simply to decide whether Europe or America is better, it's to identify which market goes exceptionally well and what the rest of us could learn from it. So let's get to the first tee, Marky, and dig in deep. So I'll start with hole one. The question: who built a bigger and more powerful plant and equipment rental industry? For this hole, we're measuring absolute scale. So population, construction output, revenue per employee, rental penetration. Help explain why one market is bigger, but it doesn't determine this hole. Those measures always belong elsewhere in the Ryder Cup. So my case for the US, you know, as we know before, we'll get on your fight for Europe. So let's start with the US. America starts with an enormous advantage. We can all agree with that. The American Rental Association estimated US construction equipment and tool rental revenue at approximately $78.7 billion in 2024. ARA also estimated its members collectively owned approximately $213 billion of equipment at original cost. But perhaps the best demonstration of American scale isn't the overall market. It's United Rentals. United Rentals generated approximately $16.1 billion of total revenue in 2025. At the end of 2024, its fleet stood at approximately $21.4 billion at original equipment cost, while the business operated 1,686 rental locations globally, including 1,433 in the United States. Think about that. One rental company has more than 14,000 locations in one country. America's scale provides some enormous competitive advantages. It gives major operators huge purchasing power with manufacturing. They can support specialist fleets that would be difficult for smaller operators to justify. They can invest heavily in technology, logistics, and telematics and data. They can move equipment between regions and service national customers across enormous geography, and critically, their scale creates acquisition firepower. So my argument, if you're a major contractor, what does scale actually give you? One supplier, thousands of locations, billions invested in fleet, huge specialist capability, and the ability to move equipment around the entire continent. United Rentals alone generates $16.1 billion. Europe simply doesn't have the rental company operating at anything approaching that scale. So then, Marky, give me Team Europe. I think I've split the fairway there.
I think, look, you've drove one up the middle, mate, that's for sure. But look, Europe shouldn't concede quite so quickly. The European Rental Association and KPMG market study estimated European equipment rental turnover at approximately 33.5 billion euros, with approximately 33.9 billion forecast for 2025. Now, that study covers 17 countries, representing more than 95% of the rental activity across the EU, EFTA and UK markets. Now, interestingly, the UK, Germany and France alone account for 60% of the European market. Europe alone has some formidable rental business. I mean, look, Loxam generated approximately 2.47 billion revenue in 2025 and operates an extensive international network. Then you've got companies like Boels Rental. Boels reported approximately 1.86 billion of revenue in 2025. They got 800 plus depots across 27 countries and more than 8,800 employees. And this is where Europe's defence becomes interesting, because American rental companies have an enormous integrated domestic market. European rental companies have had to expand across completely different markets. Britain isn't France, France isn't Germany, and Germany isn't Sweden. We've got different languages, different regulations, different taxation, different construction markets, and different customer expectations. So while Europe cannot compete with America's absolute scale, companies such as Loxam and Boels have demonstrated an impressive ability to operate at scale across different borders. So look, to summarise my argument, America has scale, absolutely. I'm not denying that. But let's recognise what the European companies have actually achieved. Boels operating across 27 countries. Loxam has built a genuinely multinational rental company. United Rentals as one gigantic home market. European rental companies have had to become good across multiple, completely different markets. So America might have built a bigger business. Europe might have, Europe have built some of the harder ones to run.
Yeah, but let's remember on this first hole, it might be an easy par three, perhaps. It's a chip in, but it's about scalability, and maybe it's a bit weighted, but let's have a look at I'll do the Stato numbers for this one, and you'll do the stats numbers for the next one. The US, 78.7 billion estimated US construction equipment and tool rental revenue 2024. 213 billion approximately equipment owned by the ARA members at original cost. 16.1 billion United Rentals 2025 total revenue. 21.4 billion United Rentals fleet at original equipment cost at the end of 2024. 1,433 United Rentals locations in the US at the end of 2024. Europe, 33.5 billion across the whole rental turnover in 2024. That's just only double United Rentals on its own. 33.9 billion estimated European turnover 2025. Loxam 2.47 billion in 2025 and 1.86 billion, as you mentioned, Boels in 2025. 800 plus depots, 27 countries. To be fair, I mean, both of them are very impressive. But the killer stat, I think, the statistic I have to do a Mark Stato drop into the conversation. United Rentals alone generates revenue equivalent to a remarkably large proportion of the entire European equipment rental market. And yes, it's a different canvas, if you like. It's a different landscape. But we'll talk about that in future holes. No doubt that's going to come up. But we need the caveat immediate afterwards. It's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, I agree. United Rentals figure is totally company revenue. The European figure represent European equipment rental turnover, and we're comparing dollars with euros, perhaps. But they're not that too far away to worry about the odd pence here and there. But as an illustration of extraordinary scale achieved in the US, it's difficult to beat. We could ask, why has the US rental industry become much bigger? Because it wasn't. Remember that. This is the bit that people need to understand. It wasn't. But I think they've twigged onto the way that we spoke about how they value their machines now. What's the best point of view, that they can buy equipment probably cheaper if they buy it in scale and more regular, like the UK market has. It turns it around at the same point. And they get a better second-hand market, don't they? Could Europe ever produce its own United Rentals? Well, we've spoke about that at length in the report, and we've shown one of our biggest hire companies in the UK. It just doesn't work. The independents seem to be crushing it. And I suppose independents in Europe also are doing equally as well. Although Boels has shown that your argument that in Europe they're probably doing really much more stronger than they are in the UK. So maybe it might work in Europe, but maybe not in the UK. So we've weighted it. Total rental market revenue, scoring of whole one, 60%. The US there, clear winner there. Scale of leading rental companies, 25% weighted. We've put that out of the 100. Again, the clear USA seem to win that. Depot network and scale, 15%. Europe 25. US 75.75. Europe gets multinational network accreditation, but I think the weighted score out of 100 is massive towards the US. It looks like 3.75% really in our scoring to 96.25 in the US. So we've given it's well outside our 45 to 55 half goal range. So answers on a postcard, it could be wrong, but we're awarding this hole to the US. So that's 1-0 to US. How do you feel about that, Mark? Bit upset about
that? No, look, listen, mate, I think the challenge that we've got in Europe, as I said, is that you've got different markets, different languages, and you've in America, the sheer size of the place and the fact they speak the same language, have the same laws and the same, you could, vast space just gives you untold opportunities, doesn't it? When you've got borders and different markets and different languages, it's going to slow it down. Look, at the end of the day, America might win hole one this year. Another 10 years' time, the European market could look completely different. So, yeah, we'll see, mate. We'll see. Mate, our fingers crossed for the next hole, yeah?
Okay, so do you want to give us your turn to tee off on hole two?
Yeah, so the next hole, we're looking at profitability, where we start again with fresh research and the score isn't predetermined by America's size. So the question, which side turns rental revenue and fleet investment into the better financial return, right? So unlike hole one, absolute profit does not count. America's much larger, so using total dollars of profit would simply reward size twice, yeah? So this hole is about how hard the assets and revenue actually work. The EBITDA, the operating margins, the return on invested capital fleet, and the ability to maintain those returns through tougher markets. And when you dig into the numbers, this becomes really interesting, yeah? So, did you want to take us through USA's case then, Mark?
Yeah, okay. So the America isn't merely producing bigger rental business. The argument for the US is that the leading US businesses are producing extraordinary margins for them. We start with United Rentals. We spoke about them. In 2025, United Rentals generated $7.328 billion of adjusted EBITDA and an adjusted EBITDA margin of 45.5%. Now, that's ridiculous, really, when, its net income was approximately $2.49 billion, representing a 15.5% net income margin. So think about that in the context of capital-intensive rental business. For every $100 United Rentals generates in revenue, approximately 45.50 cents reaches adjusted EBITDA. And United isn't an isolated example. So Herc Rentals reported in 2025 adjusted EBITDA of approximately $1.818 billion on revenue of $4.376 billion. That's an adjusted EBITDA margin of 41.5%. Margins actually fell from 44.4% in 2024, partly because the enormous H&E acquisition and the associated integration costs. So, that's just standing out where we are. So undertaking Herc remained above 40% adjusted EBITDA, even while undertaking this transformational acquisition.
But there's even a better comparison, I think. And I called it the Ashtead test, really. This may be the killer evidence for hole 2, I think. I think I've just probably curled it right around that large bunker on the corner there and got it about 10 yards from the hole, I reckon. Because it removes a lot of the usual accounting excuses. Ashtead's owns Sunbelt operations in both North America and Britain. Same parent company, same broad industry, same financial reporting framework, different rental markets. For the year ending April 25, Ashtead reported its North American general tool business produced 6.397 billion revenue, 3.478 billion adjusted EBITDA, and it implies the EBITDA majority of approximately 54.4%. And its return on investment was 20% Sunbelt Rental Holdings. North American Specialty was even stronger on capital returns, 30% return on investment, again Sunbelt Rental Holdings. This is where the sources are. Now, compare Britain. Ashtead reported UK return on investment of only 7%. That part of Sunbelt Rentals Holdings. That's a massive difference. Under effectively the same corporate ownership, the North American general tool business was generating around 3 times the return on investment of UK operation. And the North American speciality was generating more than 4 times the UK return. This is what I think we've always expected. You know, we are price-driven monkeys in the UK. Sorry, and maybe not so much in Europe, but definitely in the UK. You know, we allow customers to push us around, where in America it's like, that's the value of the machine, mate. That's what I want. Do you want it or not? You know, that makes America's argument considerably stronger than simply comparing United Rentals with Loxam. So why could America produce these returns? Scale helps, of course, but I think there's more to it. A consolidated rental market can create better pricing discipline. That's where I think the US are dominating, is because they've got larger businesses consolidated, they cover much more area, and customers are probably bought in to just 1 or 2 different companies. So therefore they're not as price driven as the 4,000-5,000 I think you'll find in the UK alone. So large customers increasingly accept rental as an alternative to ownership now. You know, so they are probably in that stage, perhaps you could argue, and you may argue this in a minute, that because the UK market's a little bit more mature, that we've gone past that. I don't know what you call it. It's the new kiddie on the block, so you don't really look at the rate as much. You just realise you haven't got to invest all your cash into buying your own fleet and running it. And technology helps operators price, move and utilise the equipment. They're high on technology. We'll talk about that in a bit in another hole. So my argument, Mark, you know, forget who has the most revenue for a minute. Look at what happens to the money. And that's where it's all about. So forget about the scale and the volume and the amount of machinery. United Rentals has got more chance to fuck it up than smaller businesses in the UK, but it's producing 45% adjusted EBITDA margin. Herc is above 40%. And we've probably got the cleanest comparison available. Sunbelt, under the same ownership, generates 20% return in North America, general tool, against 7% in Britain. America isn't simply biggest, it's monetising rental equipment much better, in my opinion. What do you reckon on that?
Well, look, I think Europe certainly is.
You know, I've got a tap in.
You got what?
You know, I've got a small tap in. I think I've done one of those, you know, right over the hole there, and it's spun right back into about 2 yards. You're going to have to give me that, I think.
Well, I've got the tee in. I've put the ball on the top, and I'm ready to drive this one down the middle. So look, what you got to bear in mind is Europe certainly is not an unprofitable rental market. Some of Europe's best operators still produce excellent results. So Loxam, for example, generated 873 million of EBITDA from a revenue of 2.472 billion in 2025. So that's an EBITDA margin of 35.3. And that's particularly noteworthy because European construction markets were subdued. So Loxam's revenue actually declined approximately 4% during 2025, yet it still produced positive free cash flow of 185 million and remains profitable. That's a decent resilience argument for Europe, by the way, than Boels. Sorry, in Europe. Then we've got Boels. So in 2025, Boels generated 1.862 billion in revenue with a EBITDA of 590 million. So that works out at 31.7%. Again, that's, that came with several European construction markets were challenging. Boels EBITDA was down by only 0.4%, despite difficult conditions in parts of its geographic portfolio. So Europe isn't getting destroyed because its businesses are badly run. It's far from it. Look, there are European businesses demonstrating respectable capital returns. So VP, the UK specialist rental group, currently reports a return on average capital employed of 11.2%. Speedy's published figures show an ROCE of approximately 9.9%, although that's fallen from 14 in the comparative period. But those aren't disastrous numbers. And Europe's defence is that the headline US EBITDA comparison is not always, completely like for like. You've got different accounting policies, business mix matters. You've got ancillary revenue matters, speciality rental matters, depreciation policies matter enormously.
So you're blaming the accountants, Mark. Really, you're blaming the accountants. I mean, Speedy lost 38 million, so we'll okay, carry on.
Yeah. Look, private European businesses also don't disclose the depth of financial information that listed American operators do. So we shouldn't pretend every margin is perfectly, comparable. But America's numbers are excellent. But let's not pretend this is completely apples for apples here. Loxam is producing the 35% EBITDA margin in a difficult European construction market. Boels is above 30%. These businesses, by the way, are managing multiple countries, currencies, regulations, and weaker construction markets, and they're still throwing off substantial cash. So profitability isn't poor in Europe. America has simply taken rental economics to another level. So, do you want me to do the numbers on this one?
Yeah, do the numbers. Let's have a review over what we just said.
Let's crunch up the numbers and see where we are. Right. So this is Team USA. 45.5% United Rentals of adjusted EBITDA margin 2025. 7.33 billion United Rentals adjusted EBITDA. 15.5% United Rentals net income margin. 41.5% Herc Rentals adjusted EBITDA margin. 54.4 approximately Ashtead North America General Tool EBITDA revenue. 20% North American General Tool return on investment. 30% North America Specialty return on investment. And then you've got Europe. 35.3% Loxam EBITDA margin. 873 million Loxam EBITDA. 31.7% approximately Boels EBITDA margin. 590 million Boels EBITDA. 11.2% VP return on average capital employed. 9.9% for Speedy return, ROCE. And then you've got 7%. 7% Sunbelt's UK return on investment under the same Ashtead reporting framework that showed 20% in the North American General Tool. So, look, what's the killer stat here? If you look at Ashtead, same company, same group, two markets. Sunbelt North America General Tool, 20% return on investment. Sunbelt UK, 7%. That's almost 3 times the return from the North American business. And North American Specialty reached 30%. So that is much harder for Europe to explain away the comparing the two unrelated companies. But look, the interesting catch, American profitability hasn't been moving relentlessly upwards. United Rentals adjusted EBITDA margin actually slipped from 46.7% in 2024 to 45.5% in 2025. Herc's have dropped as well, 44.4% to 41.5%, although its major acquisition significantly affected the year. Meanwhile, despite weak European construction conditions, Loxam continued producing at 35.3 margin and positive free cash flow, while Boels' EBITDA was almost flat year on year. So Europe actually has a decent argument on resilience. America wins the outright profitability numbers, though. Europe can argue that its operators are maintaining a reasonable profitability in considerably less favourable markets. So, look, there's a debate here. Do you want me to run through what the debate is?
Yeah, well, what we could, if you're going to ask questions, certain things, the most important is why America rental EBITDA margins are much higher. I think if we look at it generally, I think the killer for the US against the US is what you actually said. You said America, and I'll quote, America's, because I've just written it down, America has simply taken rental economics to another level. And if we go back in the recording, you said that, and I was waiting for you to do that. I think you've just put you had a great argument there, I think, but you just put yours. I think you lipped it. I think the ball lipped the hole, whereas mine just went down. And you think to yourself, are European operators then carrying too many depots, people, and duplicate costs? That's what we should be asking, perhaps. Why can the same Ashtead group apparently earn 20%? Your words or mine, I suppose. Both of ours, we've covered it. Return on investment in North America, but only 7% in Britain. We just got to ask ourselves that. Well, I know the market's different, but we all know that they chase. It's a chase to the bottom with some of them big ones in the UK for the price, haven't we? And I suppose the closing question would be, before we do the score, is if you had 100 million to invest in rental fleet tomorrow, well, where would you put it? Europe or America? And that's the key argument. And when we go to measure that, Mark, do you want to give us the measurement of that hole, your hole?
Yeah, so look, okay, let's crunch the numbers and look at the official scoring. Okay, so we agreed the scoring criteria before looking at one, so who won. So let's keep the criteria. EBITDA operating margins. Europe, the weight is 40%. Europe 0. USA, the verdict's 1. Clear USA advantage. Return on fleet capital, 35% weighting in this hole. Europe 0.25, USA 0.75. So strong USA advantage. Comparably prevents giving it 1 because Europe has got some resilience there, but USA has won it. Profit, consistency, resilience. You know what? Europe's half a point. USA's half a point. So we'll halve that. So ultimately, the weighted score, Europe's got 21.25%. USA's got 78.75%. So, if we look at how that's scored and why, it's important that we don't manipulate the matrix just because America's won again. Europe does get genuine credit. Loxam maintained a 35% EBITDA margin despite the difficult conditions, but Boels remained at approximately 32% EBITDA and was virtually flat despite challenging markets. So there are also some comparably limitations around capital return reporting. So I wouldn't justify a 96.4 thrashing like hole 1, but equally the evidence doesn't justify calling, profitability close. So the whole result is Europe 21.25, USA 78.75. USA wins hole 2.
Well, I think that one's a little bit, although the resilience is there, I would want to ask, if I was sitting in the UK or Europe, I would like to get to the bottom of why the margins are so much higher and steadier throughout the industry, not just with one company compared to Europe. And is it just because we've got too many in a saturated area? So the argument what we've had in the previous is that UK market is always looking strong at the moment for the independents, especially what the report showed us, that the independents are steaming ahead and making good profit compared to some of the majors. But in the US, it seems like that consolidation perhaps gives us not the guaranteed, but the more likely margin, high margin results. So, look, moving on. Number 2, sorry, hole 3. I think I'll just tap that one and say unlucky for you up there. This is going to be a tough one. Hole 3, the question, who gets the better rental yield from the same $100,000 or pounds of equipment, or euros even? So the hole's not about the utilisation. The whole, that's hole 4. Funny enough, coming up, but it's about pricing power. Who can charge more for the machine? Who holds rates better? Who is better at preventing discounts from destroying the economics of the fleet? What makes this particularly interesting comparison, because rental companies rarely publish simple average excavator rates for X. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it, for the price of that. So that would be really interesting if everyone said, well, I pay 100 and my average 20 tonner cost me 115,000 and I'd still charge 650 quid, like I did in 1990 when it was 63 grand, So we have to build the case from best available evidence, rate improvement, pricing discipline, rental yield indicators and comparable company reporting, I suppose. So let's get straight in again with the US. American rental industry has developed a strong reputation for pricing discipline. United Rentals explicitly manages its fleet using what's calls fleet productivity, a measure combining rental rates, utilisation and mix. In 2025, United Rentals reported 2.2% improvement in fleet productivity, despite assuming 1.5% inflationary drag in its calculation. Rental revenues increased 6% during the year. And the trend has continued in Q2 2026. United Rentals, reported, as in the calendar year, reported that fleet productivity increased 3.4% year on year. That doesn't isolate rental rate alone, because utilisation and mix are included, but it shows something important. The largest rental company in the world is still finding ways to increase revenue productivity from its fleet. Then we have Sunbelt. Ashtead's 2025 results are useful because the same parent operating on both sides of the Atlantic. North America General Tool generated 4.9 billion of rental-only revenue, up 1%. And Ashtead specifically said the increase was driven by both volume and rate improvement. North America specifically, rental-only revenue increased 11% and supported by volume and rate improvements. There's important evidence that the rate increases were, being achieved in the US, even in a moderated market, just as tough. Because I know you gave it to me, on hole 2, and you were bitching about the European market, but it's been as tough in America, in the construction market. The American industry has several structural advantages when it comes to rates. Consolidation matters in their case. When a market has a handful of enormous national players, there is potential less incentive to continually undercut competitors simply to keep the fleet moving. That is what we mentioned last hole. That might be the advantage of the model over what we have in the UK specifically. We can analyse millions of rental transactions. What equipment is scarce, which customer segments will pay more, where demand is stronger, what fleet is underutilised, and what discount is actually necessary to secure the work. it does give a big US operators a level of pricing intelligence that many smaller European companies simply cannot reproduce. So my argument really is, this is where America's scale becomes powerful. United Rentals isn't relying on depot manager deciding whether to knock another 10% off a rate. They've got an enormous database, data sets telling them what the machine should earn, where demand is strongest, and how much discount is generally required. When pricing becomes data-driven, when pricing does become data-driven rather than instinct-driven, you're much less likely to give margin away, in my opinion. And perhaps when we've got the European argument, there's a share of knowledge here that maybe it's a mixture of ways and structures and how to run your hire company. But let's hand it over to Europe and see where you are.
Yeah, all right. Well, look, let's get our ball on the tee and drive one straight at the middle, because Europe's defence is that America does not have a monopoly on good pricing. In one particularly useful specialist comparison, IPAF's 2025 rental market study looked at the mobile elevating work platforms in both Europe and the USA. Yeah. In 2024, the average UP rental rates increased approximately 1% in Europe and 1% in the USA. So an actual year-on-year rate movement in this equipment category, there was effectively nothing between the two markets. Some European countries actually did better. The Nordic markets achieved rate increases of approximately 2 to 3%, although pricing remained under pressure in markets such as Germany and France. That gives Europe an important argument here, because there isn't one European rental rate market. Nordic pricing might behave differently from French pricing, UK plant hire behaves differently from Germany, and access hire may behave differently from general plant, as we know. And specialist rental can behave completely differently again. So the European argument, look, European rental businesses also operate in markets where customers often have far more supply choice. This can create severe price competition, because it can make successful operators more disciplined. A European company cannot necessarily rely on being one of the three giant national providers. It has to justify the rate through service, availability, technical expertise, specialism, delivery performance, and of course, customer relationships. There is therefore an argument that Europe's best businesses are earning their rates in a more competitive environment. Boels and Loxam, that we've mentioned before, remain financially resilient during difficult European construction markets in 2025. Despite pressure on demand, Loxam generated 2.47 billion revenue and 873 million of EBITDA, while Boels produced 1.862 billion of revenue with a 590 million EBITDA. These margins suggest European operators are not simply discounting themselves into oblivion. America might have, better central pricing systems, but Europe operates in a much more competitive market. If you've got 10 hire companies within 50 miles, you can't simply dictate the rate. The best European countries have to earn their pricing through service, availability, specialism. And when the Nordic markets are still, putting through 2 to 3% rate increases, Europe clearly isn't incapable of pricing. Using your own test earlier, the Sunbelt test. This is probably the most interesting evidence again, because it comes from one company operating in both markets. Ashtead said its North American general tool rental only revenue increased through both volume and rate improvement. Its UK businesses also achieved both rate and volume improvements. But Ashtead then added an important sentence about Britain. While the UK rental rates were improving, rates remained an area of focus and needed to progress further. That's quite revealing. Same parents, same strategy, same board, same industry, yet management is effectively saying we still need better rates in Britain. That does seem to support the US case, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, let's just flick over before we go into the scoring, because there's on our paperwork there's a little bit of problem. Some of the stats have not come over right, on this scoring. But let's have a look at the numbers again. So, in the US, plus 2.2% fleet productivity for United. plus 3.4% in Q2 of 2026. 4.9 billion Sunbelt North America general tool rental only revenue 2025, plus 1% North America general tool rental only revenue driven by both volume and rate improvement, plus 11% North America specialist rental only revenue, plus 1% US mute rental rate increase in 2024 from iPath stats. Europe plus 1% average European mute rental rate increase, plus 2 to 3% rate increases in some Nordic markets. Pricing remained under pressure in Germany and France. We know that, you mentioned that. Sunbelt also achieved rate improvements, but Ashtead explicitly said rental rates still need to progress further, as you've mentioned there. I think the killer stats is wouldn't make this a giant number, a big push. As they say, Ashtead owns Sunbelt. That is the thing. Both sides of the Atlantic, as we mean, and management still says UK rental rates need to progress further. But it's the company itself defining pricing and the area requirement improvement. I think that's all over. It looks like the US model is dictating more than what the UK and Europe can. Not so much Europe, more UK, I suppose. And interesting, the specialist access data shows both Europe and America only increase average rental rates of about 1%. So I think they're both on an equal gap here. I mean, the catch, I suppose, the most important one, that there was no reliable continent-wide database giving a daily rental rate or identifying machines across Europe and America. There is a system out there in the UK that they're trying, aren't they, that you put your rates in and it doesn't give you a competitor's rates. I don't know if you've seen that, Mark. I can't remember the company. Software business that you tie your invoice system up to theirs, your Syrinx system or whatever, and you can't see your competitors' rates, but what you can do is you can see what the average rate is, what the highest rate is, what the lowest rate is in the industry, and you know where you are, which I think is a great tool. We'll find out who that is and put it in the comments. So look, even if we found advertised rates for a cat in London and Texas, it could be misleading, because advertised rates aren't necessarily achieved rates. That's the problem we have on this one. National accounts receive discounts. Transport may or may not be included. Damage waiver may be separate. Some people deal with damage, as we know, differently. Rental duration changes the effective rate sometimes in certain areas. We used to say, look, have it for 10 weeks. After 10 weeks, we won't charge a collection. That kind of thing. There's taxes and obviously like that. And purchases are different, I suppose, in the cost of the capital. So we can't pretend we've got a perfect £100,000 machine comparison when we don't. We're judging price, power, and yield evidence. But I think both of them have got up a good debate. Don't think there's anything on there, Mark. Do you think European hire companies discount too quickly, or does the US consolidation? What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think the thing is, I think it's a tough one. It really is, because the markets are so different. Yeah. So do European hire companies discount too quickly? No, I think it's different markets. As we said, there's a lot of companies in Europe doing a lot of stuff, and we're really fighting amongst ourselves, and that's the big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does US consolidation make it easier to hold rental rates? These are part of the debate of this whole, I suppose. Should depot managers be allowed to set rates, or should pricing, increasingly be controlled by central algorithms or data?
I think you're right. I think technology should come into that a bit more now. It's available. We should see throughout the country, just because you've got 14 tonners sitting in your depot, but the utilisation could be really high, and you think, I'm going to put mine out cheap to get them out my depot. Whereas you should be saying, well, maybe I should be moving a few of them into another depot to support that, that's probably where data is driven. And I think we've got a hold on data, but I would say that we're catching up, but we're not really there. But yeah, this is the chart that was a little bit wrong. Apologies for that, but no one can see it apart from you, Mark. But so I'll just take over the scoring for this. So the evidence and pricing yield strength was 50%. It was actually 50-50. So no advantage there. Ability to maintain improved rates, I suppose it was, both of them have got 1%. So it was 50-50 again. And market-wide evidence, IPAF data essentiality level shows that, again, rate evidence is probably hard to get, but we have got some data, as we said, with some business, and I think it's about 50-50 there. So
have we halved the hole, have we?
We've halved the hole there. It looks like it's a half hole. So it's now Europe have got themselves half a point. So it's 2.5 to half. So are Europe on the turnaround for hole 4, Mark?
Well, I think so, mate. Yeah, we'll have a good drive up the fairway, mate, and then see if we can chip one in the hole. You know what I mean? So it looks like we've halved the hole, half a point each. So let's move on to the next hole then, mate, and see if we can start taking some back. So look, hole 4, fleet utilisation, USA versus Europe again. Look, who sweats the fleet hardest? That's what this hole's all about. This is one of the cleanest operational holes in this Ryder Cup. We're judging how effectively each market keeps equipment earning rather than sitting. This means that we're looking at physical time utilisation, utilisation stability, and how well companies balance fleet growth with actual high demand. And unlike the higher rates, this one gives us a genuinely useful Europe versus USA comparison from IPAF's latest 2026 rental market data. So do you want me to hand that over to you, Mark, your honour, to tee off?
Yeah, well, I think this is where I'm going to come back into it. I think the strongest American evidence comes from powered access, I suppose, like you've just mentioned there. According to IPAF's 2026 rental market report, US mute utilisation in 2025 was around 70%. So that was a very strong figure for a mature rental market. Even more importantly, the US reaches utilisation while carrying a fleet of roughly 875,000 mutes. Now, I've got to say this, that people will start shouting, oh, our utilisation, I can hear the people from Lynch and Flannery, oh, our utilisation is 85%. But this is a market. We're talking about market stats here. We're not just talking about one company. And obviously the companies with a higher utilisation tend to do better. But, if they've got their pricing right as well. So 875,000 mutes, Mark. The fleet grew around 2% during 2025. So America isn't maintaining high utilisation because it's starved the market of equipment. It has an enormous fleet that still keep around 7 machines out of every 10 effectively working. So that's quite impressive when you look at the whole industry. The argument, I suppose, for the US, therefore, is that America benefits from scale here too. Large national operators can shift equipment between branches and regions. They're not relying perhaps on a rehire market that we tend to have, like the Alliance Link and all that kind of stuff. We have very clear in power access in the UK, the Link and the other one, whatever it's called. A machine sitting idle in one market doesn't necessarily stay there. Big companies can use the telematics, the central fleet planning, data, and I know Europe's getting this way, and national account information, to move their equipment, I suppose, from one place to another, better suited because they've got that kind of knowledge there and then. So United Rentals' own fleet productivity methodology, which is worth reading for anyone who's trying to get into hire, or rental rate plus time utilisation plus fleet mix. I mean, that's their calculation, because management sees those three things as central to maximising the fleet returns. You know, that's what their management sees. That's the thing that they breathe every day. And maybe we could learn a bit from that. I mean, I'm sure there's companies over here that do exactly the same. But as an overall, I don't think the industry looks at it like that. We're very much driven by utilisation. In January the 1st, when we come back from holiday, from Christmas, it's like get it out all costs and fuck the price. In 2025, let's have a look at that. You know, United Rentals fleet productivity improved 2.2%, despite the average OEC of its fleet growing 3.9%. I think that's important to bear that in mind. It means that business increased fleet investment while still extracting more productivity from the fleet. I think that's the key line of my argument. The danger of getting huge is buying thousands of machines that end up sitting in yards. We know that. You know, we've seen companies get carried away and they buy depots. They try and buy the market, and sometimes even worse. They open I've seen. One of my arguments where I've been before is like, I think we should buy a company to set up in a region, and then someone, says to me, and the shareholders say, now, why would we want to spend £6 million on buying someone else's company when we could spend £6 million of our own money on our own kit? And I'm like, well, because you haven't got the customers. But, that's a different conversation. The US access fleet is around 875 units, and with a utilisation of 70%. So that's kind of my argument. And the biggest companies are using proper fleet analytics to decide where it goes. You know, they're moving their equipment, I think, far better than anyone else. And they're not just buying more kit; they're trying to make each machine earn. So that's my drive. See what you come back with.
Yeah, look, let's put my ball on and get it up there. So, look, Europe's closer than the first three holes on this one because in 2024, European MUP utilisation averaged approximately 64%. And crucially, it held steady despite the difficult construction conditions. And that matters because Europe had slower economic growth, weak construction in major markets such as Germany, France, and the UK, and considerable uncertainty. Yeah, we've been talking about that for a while, Mark, haven't we? The uncertainty here, yeah?
Yeah.
Yet the industry still maintained an average utilisation level in the mid-60s. In 2025, the picture became more fragmented. Spain, Italy, the Nordic markets improved utilisation, while Germany, France, the Netherlands, and UK remained under a lot of pressure. Europe's fleet also grew, only about 1% in 2025, but as businesses increased their focus on replacement and optimization rather than indiscriminate expansion. And that's that is a very European argument. You could argue that Europe may actually be showing better fleet discipline. US fleet growth resumed in 2025. Europe largely resisted the temptation. European operators appear to have said, we're not just going to keep adding to the fleet just because we've historically grown it. Instead, they concentrated on replacing old equipment, optimising what they already had. And they might not produce the highest headline utilisation today, but it may be a healthier long-term fleet strategy. And Europe isn't one market. Utilisation in Spain or Scandinavia could look completely different from Germany or Britain. So a continental average, inevitably hides excellent operators. America has the higher headline utilisation number, but Europe deserves credit for discipline. When construction softened, European operators didn't just, keep throwing capital at the fleet. Fleet growth dropped to around 1%, and operators concentrated on replacement and optimisations. Sometimes good fleet management isn't about buying another 100 machines. It's knowing when not to, Mark.
Yeah. Okay, good argument. But you'll have to give me some stats on that.
Do you want me to give you the stats on this one?
Yeah, you cover the stats.
Let's have the stats on this whole then. Look, right. So USA, 70% on US MUP utilisation 2025. And as you said, Mark, 875,000 approximate US MUP in the rental fleet in 2025. That's plus 2% US mute fleet growth in 2025 and plus 2.2% United Rentals fleet productivity in 2025. So United Rentals defines the fleet productivity around rates plus time, utilisation plus mix. So let's look at Europe then. Europe, 64% average European mute utilisation 2024, plus 1% European mute fleet growth in 2025. Strong utilisation trends were reported in Spain, Italy and the Nordics. Pressure remained in Germany, France, Netherlands and the UK. But look, this isn't the simplest stat of the whole, right? USA utilisation 70%, Europe roughly mid-60s. There's only a few percentage points there. But in rental, a few percentage points of utilisation across billions of pounds of fleet can actually make an enormous difference. So if you have 1 billion of fleet, moving utilisation from 64 to 70% means a huge amount of additional earning time without buying another machine. And that's why this whole matters. We've got to be careful here though, Mark, because the strongest directly comparable public utilisation data is for powered access, not every category of plant and tools, yeah? So an excavator fleet may behave differently. Small tools, pumps, power and specialist rental can achieve completely different utilisation patterns. And even utilisation itself can be measured differently because, you know, you've got physical utilisation, the percentage of the fleet on hire, time utilisation, the percentage of available days rented, and then the financial utilisation, the revenue produced relative to the fleet cost. So we should never claim that every American rental machine runs at 70% and every European one at 64%. But what we can say is one of the best internationally comparable rental data sets available. America currently has the utilisation advantage, Mark.
Yeah, and I think, look, we've got to go with what stats we've got. I mean, all I would say to people is, yeah, you could argue the different products out there and if they're different utilisations compared to this side of the pond or that side of the pond, but then get your shit together. Get the association should be producing more data, shouldn't they? Because data does help these companies. But the rules were straight from this whole market. It was all about utilisation. The only facts, real figures that we could produce was from iPath. Is, you know, the only questions I would say to the listeners that were listening there, what is good utilisation? You know, 60, 70, 80%. We've always had rule of thumb, isn't it? 70% you're kind of breaking even, 75% you're nearly there, 80% you're making good money. 85%, you know, is 85% brilliant fleet management or evidence that you haven't got enough machines? You know, you don't want to be 90%, do you? Perhaps because you know that you're not going to be able to supply that demand. And you know, another question is, do Europe's fragmented depot networks leave too much equipment sitting locally? I think we asked the questions, these questions, debate questions, we'll probably put on the, you know, as questions for these episodes, do you think, you know? But look, there's an important business lesson here. There's a point that's bigger than Europe versus America. The rental business can destroy itself chasing utilisation. We've seen it. You know, if £100,000 machine would rent for £1,000 a week, which is that old 1% rule, but you discounted it to 600, simply just to keep it working. Look, your utilisation statistic looks brilliant, doesn't it? But your investment return may not. So, which is why maybe whole 3 and 4 work well together. Rate times utilisation, the fleet yield. I think people have to look at that. You know, are they getting enough for their money? And you know, if the industry, and I'm not trying to get people to shut and close their business, but if the industry is flooded because you cannot get the rate because there's the utilisation of machinery across the UK or Europe is too low, or US or whatever region you're in, then maybe you shouldn't be in it. You know, I don't know if that's too controversial or not, but maybe it is. But look, it's a closer one here in a way, but the utilisation is the evidence. You know, 60% was the weighting for this, and the US comes out 70% versus mid-60s. I mean, 64%, you said yourself, $1 billion fleet at 64%. There's a different return if you get it to 70. I think that's the kick in the bollocks, really. The fleet productivity optimization, US big companies analytics providing stronger evidence, really. They they're proving the stats, whereas we're not proving it as much. Maybe we're going to get there with some of our technology and our utilisation stats. I don't know, and maybe that's something that if everyone bought into, it would be really interesting to see one company pull that all together. Discipline versus demand. I think Europe, you proved that. I think you was up there. Europe earns credit for restrained fleet growth. Because they do continuously try and grow and move their market. But I think just edging it over our 55%, 62.5% of the US on that one. So it comes into like 3.5 to half mark at the moment.
It seems to, mate. Yeah, we're lagging behind here, mate. But don't worry.
Let's steam on, because these will be quite long reps. We'll get into hole 5. And the question, who buys the fleet better? Not simply who spends the most. The hole's about whether we scale is converted into genuine procurement advantage. OEM buying power, purchase cost, standardisation of equipment is one thing. Fleet planning, complete capital discipline here. The perfect statistic would be the actual discounted United Rentals, Boels or Loxam receives from Caterpillar, JCB, Genie, whoever, JLG, Volvo, you name it, Mandatory, don't want to upset anyone, and the others. They understandably don't publish that. And that's the problem you have. But so this whole is to be judged from purchasing scale, procurement structure, I think fleet strategy, and the evidence of what happens after these purchasing decisions are made. And it produces another fascinating comparison here, really. I'll start with the case again with the US. Start with the sheer size of the checkbook. I think I'm going to start there. United Rentals spent approximately $4.19 billion on gross rental capital expenditure during 2025. It expects gross rental equipment purchases of approximately $4.3 billion to $4.7 billion in 2026. That's just one company. The purchasing program is larger than the annual revenue of most rental companies in the world. Herc Rental spends another $1.1 billion on rental equipment during 2025, and ended the year with approximately $9.5 billion of fleet at original equipment cost. So we're not talking depreciated product here. We're talking about at original cost. So between just United Rentals and Herc, we're talking about more than $5 billion of annual fleet buying before we even include Sunbelt. That's a phenomenal negotiating leverage, I think. One of the arguments I've seen on that is that, we couldn't get the amount of Genie product in the UK that we wanted in my particular business. And that was because when there was a shortage after COVID, the American market was paying 20% more for that machine than the UK. So what does that tell you? But then we ended up with no machinery, and then we let the Chinese come in and take over the access market. So there you go. So why matters, scale matters at the OEM table. This is what my argument is. One customer says, I like 20 machines. Another potentially needs thousands of machines across hundreds of locations every year. They're completely different commercial relationships. Obviously they are. The biggest US rental companies can potentially negotiate around far more than the sticker price, as we call it. Without doubt. Volume, production slots they'll get, warranty arrangements will be different. You name it. Telematics thrown in, probably better finance, perhaps, and because the normally quantities of the same equipment could be deployed across the whole domestic market. Standardisation, which was mentioned earlier, I said it becomes one of the key factors here. So my argument, we're kidding ourselves. We don't think buying 10 excavators and buying 10,000 excavators can create the same conversation with the manufacturer. United Rentals spent over $4 billion on rental fleet in 1 year. If you're an OEM, that's not just another customer. That's a strategic account. America's turned rental consolidation into enormous purchasing leverage. And I don't want to overgo it, but United Rentals 4.1 million in spend in 2025 and still produce 2.1 billion of free cash flow. So after that fleet investment, that's a significant, because purchasing power isn't useful. It's continual fleet purchases swallow up all cash the business generates. United can invest billions of equipment and still produce billions of cash. So that's my argument.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, let's have a look at Europe and give you a bit of a drive up the fairway there, mate. So let's be real here. Europe can't match United Rentals' individual purchasing volume, right? But Europe is certainly not buying fleet like a collection of small independents. You look at Boels. In 2025, it invested 424.5 million in fleet and other assets, and that followed 640.1 million of capital expenditure in 2024. Although the earlier figure included acquisition-related investment. Then in January 2026, Boels announced an initial order for 3,000 mutes, as part of a significant program to expand and renew its fleet. 3,000 machines in one procurement program is hardly weak purchasing power. So you look at the Boels procurement model. It now operates a digital procurement environment built around SAP Ariba, designed to centralise sourcing and supplier transactions. Boels says it gives them greater transparency, streamlined processes, and a better supplier data management. And it has something American doesn't: a genuine pan-European procurement requirement. Its fleet has to work across 27 countries. Different emission regimes, by the way, different transport requirements, different customer expectations, and of course, different climates, and specialist different markets. So Boels says it works with OEMs to plan and develop machines around its market lifestyle requirements. That gives Europe a real argument. You've got the European fleet philosophy as well. European operators may not have a greater incentive to think about whole life suitability rather than simply achieving the lowest initial purchase cost. Boels described its 2026 Axis investment in terms of equipment that is reliable, modern, energy efficient, safe, and critically, broadly deployable through its entire service life. That's a very important phrase, because the cheapest machine isn't necessarily the best rental price. You think this machine has to stay working, be easy to repair, retain its residual value, satisfy customers, move between markets, and remain compliant for years. Look, let's summarise it up for Europe. Buying well isn't just beating the manufacturer down another 5%. The real question is what happens during the next 5 or 7 years. Will the machines work across different markets? Will it retain its value? Can you service it? Can you move it from Germany to Holland or France? Boels just ordered 3,000 machines and runs procurement across 27 countries. Europe isn't buying small anymore. Another one's Loxam, right? Provides us a further perspective. By summer 2025, its rental fleet consisted of approximately 600,000 pieces of equipment with a gross book value of 5.3 billion and more than 1,000 European branches. That's an enormous fleet. And following weaker European construction markets in 2025, Loxam said it planned to increase its equipment investment to capture the expected recovery and renew its fleet. Again, not random buying. That's capital allocation responding to the cycle. Do you want me to run through the numbers, Mark, and let's have the comparable stats?
Yeah, let's compare the stats now. Your turn.
Right, so USA, 4.19 billion United Rentals gross capital rental capex in 2025. 4.3 billion to 4.7 billion United Rentals expected 2026 gross rental purchases. 1.10 billion Herc rental equipment expenditure 2025. 9.5 billion Herc fleet at its original equipment cost. 2.18 billion United Rentals 2025 free cash flow despite enormous fleet investment. So let's have a look at Europe in comparison. 424.5 million Boels 2025 fleet and other capital expenditures. 3,000 machines was initial Boels Axis mute order announced for 2026. Loxam runs 600,000 pieces of equipment in its fleet. 5.3 billion Loxam fleet gross book value as of September 2025. And again, we've got a footprint here of working in 27 countries. That's Boels. So the killer stat, I suppose, United Rentals alone bought 4.19 billion of rental fleet in a single year. But for context, Boels' entire 2025 capital investment in fleet and other assets was 424.5 million. Not perfectly comparable, different definitions and company sizes, but it illustrates the purchasing leverage spectacularly. But let's have a look at Boels. It's placed an order for 3,000 access platforms. So Europe's not, it's not turning up at the OEM with a shopping trolley, is it?
I suppose we put it that way. Yeah. Well, look, yeah, go on.
I was just going to say that there's things to consider. This hole needs a stronger caveat than some of the others, really, because there's information that's commercially confidential. A company, you have to take into account that some companies could order 5,000 machines and theoretically negotiate badly. Another company could order 500 and have an exceptional OEM relationship. And the headline machine discount isn't about everything, because a buyer might receive a lower purchase price, another might receive a better warranty or free servicing, guaranteed buyback, some sort of parts support, factory priority, or some sort of disposal support. So purchase volume is evidence of bargaining power, but not proof of the lowest lifetime equipment cost.
I think one. I'll just stop you there. I think one of the evidence of that is the Hitachi UK debate. Remember when Synergy was set up and they went into partnership with Hitachi? It was all about that they would. The reason behind that, people don't realise, is because of what you're saying there. You buy 1,000 machines. What's the likelihood you're going to dump 1,000 machines at the same time into the second-hand market in 3 to 4 years' time? Very likely the majority of those machines are going to go back into the market. So not only have a manufacturer sold at a heavily discount because you bought 1,000 machines off me, so you haven't made the margin, you've now ruined the second-hand market because there's so many available. Hence the reasons why they took that away from it. So Hitachi UK now really focus on the one-man bands. They don't want to sell 100 machines or 200, 500 machines to Lynch or Flannery. They don't want to, because they're not getting the margin. So you can see that. So, and then ask yourselves, really, how much cheaper do we generally think? And I'm defending the European side here, that United Rentals buys the same machine as a medium-sized European hire. It can't be that much, can it? Because if let's say the machine's worth 100,000, just because I'm going to buy 1,000, I'm not going to get it for 50,000, am I? I might get 10,000 off that, I presume, but the next man in line might get 2, 3, 4,000, depending. There must be a limit to what the margins that are going to let them go, aren't they? So you've got that counter argument that just because United can come in, and is it good businesses for the OEMs? And we're presuming that they're buying, 5,000 machines a year, that they're all going to be of one make, and they're not, are they? They're going to spread their risk. Surely the factory aren't going to put all their eggs in one basket, so the pricing will reflect that. So you might not be able to go and buy 1,000 Hitachis or 1,000 Komatsus, 1,000 Caterpillar machines, because they just won't allow that to happen, because that's pretty much taking up the majority of their manufacturing facility, isn't it? For one thing, and all eggs in one basket. And then you've got to look at the residuals that we've argued about. Would you sacrifice 5% purchase discount for a machine that achieves a 10% higher residual value? Possibly. Depends what rental rate I suppose you're getting throughout that. And again, a question for everyone is, does Europe have an advantage because its machines increasingly have to satisfy stricter emissions and environmental requirements? I think that is one of the things. Second-hand market, we know, is definitely affected, where some machines in Europe at the moment have to be converted back to get into Africa and places like that, but that's where we are. But look, without going on, the scores there, they're heavily rated, 45% OEM borrowing power. Of course, the US wins that. But the procurement sophistication and standardisation, it's a draw, really. I think both sides operate sophisticated central procurement systems. And then fleet specification and capital discipline, what we're talking about there, better emissions. And Europe earns an advantage for life cycle, multinational and increasingly disciplined fleet approach, I think. So they just win that. And I would be comfortably going by our scoring, even though, it's in that line of the 45 to 55 mark between both of them. So you could turn around and say, well, US is more weighted because of the purchasing power. But we've done that particularly in that grey zone, that when they're close. So that's a half score there, Mark. So that would make it 4-1 at the moment to US. But, and we'll move on to our last hole of the of the episode, because we're into probably an hour and a half already. So we'll probably have 3 parts to this. So, if you're enjoying the debate and you like the golf, then come on. But we'll move straight on to, I think it's my turn, is it?
Hole 6, replacement cycle.
So, replacement cycles. The question, who gets the buy, hire, maintain, sell equation right? This is not simply who has the youngest fleet. It's replacing too early, we know destroys value because you haven't sweated the asset. And replacing too late means you've got massively raising maintenance costs, which we knew a particular machine many years ago when we benchmarked it rose from literally 5.5% of its cost of rent of maintenance to 11% just by 1 year. It's a massive increase. So the winner is the side that appears better at finding economic sweet spots. So I'll get straight on to this one. The major American operators manage replacement on an industrial scale. Herc Rentals provides unusually useful evidence, believe it or not. At the end of 2025, in its rental fleet, it says here, had an original equipment cost of approximately 9.5 billion, yet it had an average fleet age was only 45 months, 3.75 years. It was 46 months a year. It was 46 months a year earlier. So a year earlier. So that tells you something. That's significant. Herc especially says it routinely sells used equipment to manage repair and maintenance costs, fleet composition, fleet age, and fleet size. Nothing really to do to try and get the cash in. I'm sure there's a little bit of an argument there. In other words, disposal isn't simply this machine looks old, sell it. It's part of a fleet optimization. During 2025, Herc spent, it says here, 1.09 billion buying rental equipment and received 448 million from disposals. It was simultaneously buying and selling enormous quantities of equipment. So the US argument, which we're saying here, is America's scales provide a major advantage here because the largest companies have huge data sets. Imagine knowing the timeline history of tens of thousands of your excavators, telehandlers, booms, scissor lifts, everything, You can potentially identify when the maintenance starts accelerating, the utilisation starts declining because of that, which machine manufacturers retain the value. I mean, we've always wanted to know that. Everyone says, oh, buy that machine. But have they ever checked it against another machine to see what their real life investment is? And therefore, crucially, the point where another year's rental income is no longer worth keeping the asset. This is a sophisticated fleet life cycle management. So, to enhance my argument, this isn't about somebody walking around the yard deciding a machine looks tired, which maybe have a couple more hours on it. Herc has a 9.5 billion fleet averaging just 45 months. These companies have enough data to show what happens to a particular model in 3, 4, 5, and 6 years. They can calculate when the machine stops earning enough to justify keeping it. That's my case for the US market.
Right. Well, let's get one straight up there near the green for this one. Look, Europe's got a very different argument. European operators have become increasingly focused on fleet optimization, as we said before, rather than just endless fleet expansion. During the recent weaker European construction environment, powered access fleet growth slowed to around 1%, with operators focusing increasingly on replacement and optimization rather than just simply adding equipment. That suggests that European companies are being selective about capital deployment rather than blindly pursuing younger fleets. And this matters because youngest fleet does not automatically mean best fleet economics. And we've spoke about this before in a previous pod, Mark. A perfectly reliable 5-year-old excavator that has already absorbed the steepest part of its depreciation curve could potentially be a fantastic rental asset. Replacing it with a new one, just to advertise a younger average fleet, may actually reduce return on capital. So, look, the European argument, Europe has a structural reason to think carefully about replacement. Environmental regulation and the growth of low emission zones can make equipment technology obsolete before it's mechanically obsolete. So European operators increasingly have to consider engine emission standards, battery tech, urban restrictions, noise, energy efficiency, and changing customer procurement requirements. That makes the replacement decision, more complicated than how many hours has it done. A machine could be mechanically perfect and still become commercially less desirable. Boels have explicitly framed major fleet investment around equipment being modern, energy efficient, and capable of remaining widely deployable throughout its service life. That's the whole life fleet thinking rather than just simply chasing youth. So, look, the European argument in a nutshell is I'd actually challenge the idea that having the youngest fleet means you won. If I've got a 5-year-old machine that's reliable, fully depreciated, down and still earning at a strong rate, why would you sell it? The clever rental company isn't the one buying the most new machines. It's the one that knows exactly when keeping the old one stops making financial sense. I don't know if you want to. I've got some examples down from the USA that might counteract that.
On the
Herc. I think you had a Herc argument for that one, didn't you? As a counter argument.
I might have had. I think I've lost my place for it. Yeah. So I don't know where we are.
You had a 2025 example, the Herc example. And after acquiring H&E, Herc began selling acquired equipment to improve its fleet mix and utilisation. And sales of rental equipment increased by $198 million, and some equipment was deliberately pushed through the auction as the company optimised the acquired fleet. That's fleet.
I'm glad you remember that. I was in the rough there. I was trying to get me bored.
He's in the rough. Yeah, well, that's it. Would you want to carry on with that or not?
No, you carry on. You'll
all right. I don't get your ball out the rough. You know what I mean? That's fleet replacement being used strategically after an acquisition. Herc weren't saying we bought H&E, therefore we keep every machine. It was immediately saying which machine actually belong in the future fleet. And that's good management, really, from Herc, to be honest with you.
It is, and that was a statement, Red, obviously, that I lost in the flow, and that was a statement from their CEO at the time. So thanks for digging that out, Mark, and reading that through. Is it my turn to go through the stats? So I'll just take over from there.
Yeah, go for it.
So let's go through the stats before we get the final score. 45 months, Herc's average fleet age at the end of 2025. 46 months, Herc's average fleet age a year earlier. So that's telling you what they're trying to do to improve that. 9.5 billion Herc fleet at the original equipment cost. 1.09 billion rental equipment purchases in 2025. 448 million proceeds from rental equipment disposals, and plus 198 million increase in used equipment sales as Herc rationalised its enlarged fleet. Europe, the case is less about one headline average age number and more about capital discipline. fleet growth in major European access markets has slowed sharply, with operations increasingly concentrating investment on replacement and fleet optimization rather than capacity expansion. Major groups such as Boels are also explicitly selecting new equipment around the whole life deployment efficiency and future stability. So the killer stat there is the American number, Herc 9.5, rental averages just 45 months old. But then, Mark, Europe gets the immediate counter. Is that actually good? Because that's the whole debate. If Europe keeps equipment economically productive for 6 years while America replaces it in 4, Europe could actually achieve the better lifetime return. So that's a kind of a you've put that right on the green there. Fleet age alone doesn't answer the question, I don't think, and therefore the catch on this one changes the scoring. We don't have significant comparable European versus US data showing the optimum disposal age and lifetime return on identical equipment. That's important. We have excellent evidence that America's major operators manage replacement very professionally, but we also have evidence that European replacement discipline, but we don't have what we'd like to have, CAP 320 bought X rental income, maintenance, disposal X. For both continents, we've got a bit of everything. As I say, one day somebody might grab that as something to do. Therefore, we'd be wrong to award the whole simply because America's biggest company disclosed the information. So I suppose the debatable questions for everybody: what is actually the ideal age to sell the excavator? 3, 5, 7 years? Everyone will have an answer on a postcard there. Do high companies replace equipment too early because customers expect young fleets? That's an interesting one. We've always done that. We've actually been dictated to, Mark, haven't we, on sites? It has to be under 2 years, under 3 years old.
Yeah.
Which matters more, purchase discount or eventually disposal value? So we've put that on there. If a 5-year-old excavator is simply reliable, achieving 70% utilisation and earning the same rate as a new one, why sell it? I suppose people have got an argument there. But yeah, look, 3 years or 7 years, 5 years, doesn't really matter. The score is pretty even. Life cycle and disposal, US a little bit more better hard evidence from the US majors than we've got evidence-wise. That was weighted about 40%. Capital replacement discipline, we found that Europe gets the credit for sustained replacement optimisation now. Evidence of superior whole life return, it's again not enough data, but so it's about 50-50. So another half hole there, Mark, to end the part one of that as we go into around about 4.5 to 1.5 or in that. So we're going to leave it there at part one. We played the first 6 holes of the Ryder Cup plant iron, and at this stage, Team USA's is just ahead. And I think we've already learned quite a lot. The sheer scale of America's rental industry is difficult to get away from when you look at the size of the market, the businesses they've built, and the amount of equipment they're managing. America operates plant hire to another level. We also seeing that the scale translates into some real commercial advantages, particularly when we start looking at profitability and fleet utilisation. But Europe certainly hasn't been blown away. I don't think by any means. Once we've got underneath some of the headline numbers, we've found areas where the difference is much smaller than you might expect. High rates, fleet purchasing, replacement cycles have all shown us that there are different ways of getting a return from the same piece of equipment. And that's really what this whole Ryder Cup is about, really. It's not simply Europe good, America bad, or America good, Europe bad. It's asking what each market does better, and more importantly, what can we learn from each other to run a better hire business, I suppose. And we've still got 12 holes to play, so next week we'll pick up with customer service before getting into transport, damage recovery, technology, you name it. Eventually we reach the 18th hole and find out actually wins the Ryder Cup for plant hire. So after 6 holes, USA just ahead. America has the early advantage, but there's a long way to go. that's from me, Mark, and bye from Mark this week's episode. We'll catch you next week. Thanks, Mark.
The opinions expressed within this podcast are solely the individuals and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of the sponsors or its affiliates.